A Hero's Beginning, Chapter 1. The sun was setting over the city of Copolis. However, even as the day was ending, a new dawn was approaching, quickly. A boy, 13 years in age, named Drake, rode his wheelboard around the city, half-heartedly. He couldn't seem to shake off the funk he had been in for most of the past 3 years, and it didn't help that today was the last day before he would have to become an apprentice. Tomorrow would be Copolis' annual apprenticing day. Every year on this day, everyone 13 years or older who wasn't already apprenticed or an adult was required by the council to become one. But Drake didn't have any idea who he wanted to apprentice with, which meant he could definitely get stuck apprenticing in one of the tech factories with his uncle and annoying cousin Jason. It could easily turn into a huge nightmare. Not only would he be living with them, he would also be working with them every day. He would never have any time to himself, not to mention that he felt destined for more than being a factory worker for the rest of his life. Drake sighed. He wished that really was his worst nightmare. Honestly, Drake just wished he could get away from all of this, back to the way his life had been before his real worst nightmare happened. Everything had changed for him on that day. He had lost his parents in a laboratory accident 3 years past. And Larks, his younger brother, had mysteriously disappeared. After the horrible event, Drake had been forced to pack up and move in with his uncle and his cousin. He knew his relatives meant well, but they had constantly been trying to get Drake to cheer up since he had moved in. It was like they just thought he could forget about his family and what had happened to them. He wished they would just stop and leave him alone. When he had been forced to move out of his old house and into his uncle's city apartment, it had seemed like the world was ending. Drake had just never really found a chance to move on. Jason was always excited that he'd be able to hang out with Drake, and he was quick to ask if they could. It seemed as though a day didn't go by that Jason didn't ask Drake if he felt like doing something maybe fun. Drake never did, though, so recently, instead of having to tell his cousin no, he had taken to roaming the streets around the city on his own. He did this for hours, waiting for each day to end. His life was going to change tomorrow, though, for better or worse. All this time, he had been doing the only thing he knew how to do. He was waiting. Drake wasn't delusional. He knew that his family wasn't coming back. In truth, he didn't really know what he was waiting for. He only knew that he missed his family too much to stop waiting. Yet even though he couldn't block out the dreadful thoughts of how his life was about to change, he had no idea of the twists the forces of fate were bringing. His head began to hurt, so he turned his wheelboard around and headed for home, not holding out much hope about the new life he'd be starting tomorrow. Meanwhile, in a tall steel skyscraper close to the middle of Copolis, a man with neatly parted black hair and cold, calculating grayish-blue eyes sat in his office at his desk, plotting his return to power. 3 years had passed since he had found and claimed the gauntlet at the end of that terrible day, the day he had failed. It frustrated him because he didn't understand how to make the machine he was constructing work correctly, with or without it. He guessed that he was missing some key components. He just didn't know what it was. Yet, he told himself, I will find it. Just then, one of the man's business employees walked in. Mr. Malcolm, sir, your son has run away from your apartment again. Should I send out the usual people to collect him? Malcolm Smith, the CEO of SciTech Corporation, sighed. Yes, make sure the boy doesn't get into any trouble, and that anything unsightly stays under wraps. Of course, sir. The employee left Malcolm's office, and Malcolm put his head in his hands as he rested them on his desk. He couldn't figure out what his stupid design was missing. Agonizingly, he went back to his work with the fact that his son had run out again, barely registering as little more than a minor annoyance. The boy, in Malcolm's eyes at least, was nothing but a spoiled brat most of the time. Malcolm sometimes wished he had left the boy with his mother. Maybe he would send the child back, he thought wryly. But no, of course he couldn't do that. He would need an heir for his empire eventually. And the child would learn, certainly. Pushing any thoughts of the boy out of his mind, he set back to work once more. He desperately needed to solve this problem with his machine's design. Thomas Smith carefully picked the lock in the glass case that held the gauntlet. It took only a few moments for his practiced hands to maneuver the pins correctly and release the lock. He took it out and placed it inside his backpack. The metal it was made of was cold to his touch. He shivered at the thought of what he had learned the gauntlet might be capable of. That was why he was doing this, because if he didn't take it, and if the gauntlet fell into the wrong hands, it would mean untold destruction. He shoved his backpack onto his shoulders and replaced the lock in the glass case. He walked to the door of the room and opened it just a crack. A guard walked by right as he did this. Thomas had to fight the urge to jump backward. He didn't dare breathe while he waited for the guard to pass him. After the danger was clear, Thomas did one last check to make sure the hall was actually empty, and then he slipped out the door. Quietly, he went in the opposite direction of the guard, while his heart pounded heavily in his chest. After making it to the main door of the warehouse, he walked out and kept low to the ground. Staying in the shadows as much as possible, he had gotten about halfway across the grounds of the compound before he saw another guard. A short man with reddish hair and a large belly surveyed the area. As his pulse pounded, Thomas forced himself to slowly move behind a large shipping crate to avoid the guard's flashlight. The man flashed the light across the spot where he had been standing. Thomas held his breath and hoped the man hadn't seen him. The guard stayed for a few more minutes, but then he moved on. Thomas let out the breath he'd been holding and continued to cross the stockyard. After several more minutes, he finally made it to the back gate. It was just his luck that someone picked now to sound the alarm. He scrambled over the perimeter fence as fast as his arms and legs could carry him. All the while, a loud siren blared through the air. Thomas landed on the other side of the fence in a crouch and took off into the forest that surrounded the compound. He booked it as fast as he could. At some point, he heard people in the forest with him, chasing him. He had to lose them somehow. He kept running, and he came to the far edge of the forest. Before him was a clearing, and just ahead of him in the distance, he saw the dim lights of Soraiku, one of the local farming towns. Farther back and to his right, he saw the silver towers of Copolis rising out from behind the rocky terrain of the crater wall that surrounded the city. The city was set amidst an extensive mountain range that rose up around the island like towering giants. The elaborate skyscrapers seemed to be trying to reach the heights of the mountain peaks as they shimmered in the moonlight. Several sky bridges connected the buildings to one another, seeming to form an intersecting maze high in the air. A mixed culture of elves and humans gave the city an unusual variety of architecture, though there weren't many elves left on the island these days. Myths and rumors surrounded their disappearance, but their mark was definite in the buildings all the same. He didn't have time to enjoy the sight, though. He kept running. He found the old cave right where he remembered it. The entrance to the cave was overgrown with ivy so thick no one would have been able to see it unless they already knew it was there. Pulling a section of vines away, he slipped into the cave. Once he was inside, he almost laughed from relief as his eyes adjusted to the dark. He would be safe here for tonight, and tomorrow he would be able to hide the gauntlet or destroy it if he could find a way to. Sitting in the protective darkness of his temporary hideout, he was still in disbelief about what he had been told the gauntlet could do. He just hoped that he was doing the right thing. He certainly couldn't let his father finish the machine and put the gauntlet into the wrong hands, though. It was magic, after all, and he had seen what magic could do. It could be dangerous. He knew that all too well. Whoever had sent him those letters had wanted him to take it. He was sure of that. Enough, he told himself, as his thoughts spun chaotically. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Thomas tried to remember how long it had been since he'd last been to the cave. That was when his mom had still been with them. It seemed fitting. One of her favorite places to bring him when he was younger would be his refuge now. Thomas just hoped he'd be able to get back to the city and dispose of the gauntlet before apprenticing day was over. Drake 80 woke up to the sound of his alarm clock beeping loudly. Groaning, he managed to drag himself out of bed and reluctantly got dressed in a blue shirt and black jeans, wishing more than anything that something would happen so he wouldn't have to start apprenticing today, though he knew that wouldn't happen. He made his way downstairs. He found his uncle waiting for him in the apartment's small kitchen. Uncle Mason had cooked bacon, eggs, and toast for breakfast. They sat untouched on the kitchen table. Good morning, his uncle, a tall man with stark red hair and brown eyes in his early 40s, said solemnly. Grab a plate and help yourself. Drake did a double take when he heard his uncle speak. Mason never sounded that serious unless something was up. He fixed himself a plate of food and sat down in a wooden chair to eat. Where's Jason? Drake asked, keeping his head down and focusing on his eggs. He hoped he wasn't in trouble. He's still asleep, his uncle answered. Wait, what time is it? Drake asked. Won't we be late to the factory? We aren't going to the factory, Mason said. Something in his uncle's tone told Drake he probably shouldn't press the point further. Drake shrugged to himself and kept eating. He didn't say anything, even though he was thinking non-stop about where his uncle was going to take him instead of the factory. It really must have been bad for Mason to be acting this out of character. Instead, he just finished eating his breakfast, rinsed his dishes off in the sink, grabbed his backpack off the kitchen counter, and went to wait by the apartment door. He pulled out his headphones and started to tune the world out with his favorite music. When his uncle had finished eating, the two of them left the apartment and walked to the nearest maglev station, The maglev was an electromagnetic express train that ran through the outskirts of Copolis, connecting the many stations to the city's center, and ending in the port of Rendale, making it the primary form of public transportation for the city. Of course, public was dependent upon whether or not you made enough to afford it. Uncle Mason bought tickets, and they boarded the train and took their seats. Drake watched the world outside blur into streaks of color as the train picked up speed. He pulled up the hood of his jacket and blankly stared out the glass window. They exited the train 2 stations down, closer to the city council's private estates. They walked 2 blocks from the station until Drake's uncle stopped in front of one of the largest skyscrapers. Drake followed his uncle inside and waited in a lobby chair while Mason talked to the building's manager. At one point, it seemed like the 2 men were arguing. Drake wasn't sure because he was still listening to music. Then Drake's uncle pulled out a piece of paper and shoved it at the manager. They must have finally reached an agreement because Mason walked back over to get it. Drake took off his headphones as his uncle approached. "What's going on?" Drake asked. "Come on," his uncle said. "Let's go meet your new apprenticeship master." Drake followed his uncle to the skylift. They walked inside and took it up to the top floor. It had a glass window on the back, and Drake could see over the entire city as they ascended. The skylift dinged when they reached the penthouse floor. Mason stepped off the skylift, and Drake followed closely behind him as they walked down the grand hallway. They came to stand before a large set of double doors with ornate gold trim and vintage stained glass. His uncle knocked on the door 3 times with one of the gold knockers attached to the doors. After a few moments, the door opened, and an elderly woman wearing a housekeeper's dress stepped out. "What is it? I'm afraid Lord Zachary is not accepting guests," she said in a morose tone. But she still managed to sound defiant. "My nephew is here to become Lord Zach's new apprentice," Mason explained gruffly. "Wait, what?" Drake thought. He was going to be whose apprentice? Master Zachary did not say anything about a new apprentice, the maid said. Mason sighed and pulled the same papers he had shown the manager out of his coat pocket and showed it to her. Drake watched her eyes widen as she read them. But she was back to business as soon as she had finished reading. "Very well," she said. "You can wait for the master in the library. Do you need me to—" "I know where it is," Mason cut her off sharply. Drake followed his uncle through the grand penthouse. The main room was very nice, and it had a staircase leading up to the 2nd floor, where a glass chandelier hung above the room. If the main room had been nice, though, the library was incredible. It was 2 floors of nothing but books. Inside were books from floor to ceiling, and bookshelves that lined the entire walls. There were even stacks of books on the tables and some on the floor. Another chandelier hung in this room, though it wasn't quite as grand as the first. "This place is incredible," Drake said. "Am I really going to apprentice here?" His uncle shot him a sharp look. "Yes, you'll be doing your apprenticeship here. This place is something else, all right," he said coldly, as his gaze rested on the portrait of the beautiful young woman hanging on the wall. A few minutes later, the maid came back in, followed by a man dressed in a long red coat. The man had long brown blonde hair to his shoulders. He had plain brown eyes, and he carried a long cane. "Master Zachary," the maid introduced him. "That will be all, Melinda," the man dismissed her. Melinda curtsied as she left. Zachary turned a hard stare on Drake's uncle. "I thought I made it clear you were never to return here, Mason. Or did you come to take her portrait from me as well?" He scoffed angrily. "Oh, trust me, I didn't want to be here," Mason shot back. "You shouldn't be surprised, though. You know more than anyone that I'm not very keen at doing as I'm told." "That's one thing we can agree on, I suppose," Zach said in a milder tone. "So what did make you climb all the way up here to trouble me?" "You know why I'm here," Mason said. Lord Zachary sighed. "Yes, I'm all too aware. You know, even after all this time, I still hate your sense of humor." Zach poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and took a long sip. "I mean, the irony of this situation really is just maddening. Drake is here to start as your new apprentice," Mason explained. "I don't suppose I get any say in this?" Zach asked. "I've got David's will here if you decide you want it to come to that," Mason said. Zachary smiled. "What about you, boy?" he said, addressing Drake for the first time. "How do you feel about all this?" The Lord drank from his glass of water again and took a long moment to regard Drake. "I don't know," Drake answered. It seemed as if this really was turning into a nightmare. He was sure Lord Zachary considered him as useless as an old scrap of paper, just lying around collecting dust. Zach laughed. "Oh yes, this will be good fun." "Good luck on your first day," his uncle called after him as he started to walk away. Drake was left standing in front of Zach. "All right then, boy. What's your name?" the Lord asked him. "I'm Drake," Drake answered. Okay, Drake, do you know how apprenticeship works? Not really. Excellent. Then I want you to understand how our relationship from this point on is going to work. I'm the master, and you're now my apprentice, so from here on out, you're going to be learning all about the ways of the world. Drake didn't know how to feel about that, so he just nodded. Your first lesson starts now. You are to clean up all of these books lying about, and make sure they are organized in alphabetical order. Once you have that done, you will report to Mistress Melinda for your next lesson. Drake stood there in shock. Zachary smiled, took another drink of water, then turned on his heel and left the room. Drake took a look around the massive library. He picked up a stack of books, sighed, and got to work. Not that he had much of a choice, apparently. He wondered why his uncle had such a problem with Lord Zachary, and why he would have brought Drake here to be an apprentice if that was the case. It must have something to do with those papers Uncle Mason had brought with him. Drake had a vague memory of seeing them after his parents were gone. Could they have been his parents' final wishes? His father hadn't ever been all that wordy. Would he have really had a written will? He also wondered how this was supposed to teach him to be a lord. He didn't even think that he wanted to be a lord. It took him close to 3 hours to clean up all the books and get halfway through organizing them. That was when Mistress Melinda walked in. "What game are you playing at?" she yelled at him. "You're supposed to meet me in the kitchen half an hour ago. Now you're going to be late for sure." "What?" Drake started. "Oh, come here, boy. Our Master Zachary will have both our hides," Melinda said. Drake decided he'd better do as she said. He followed her into the penthouse kitchen, which was elegant, but still a kitchen all the same. She handed him a folded note. "You are to go out and collect the things on that list," she told him, "and I suggest you get a move on. Master Zachary can be quite unsavory if he misses the dinner." Drake tried to tell her that he didn't know the first thing about shopping, but before he knew it, though, she had him out the door and on his way. She had given him a bag full of creditor chips to buy what was on the list. Drake walked down the street. He opened up the note and read the list. Or he would have, if there had been a list. Instead, it had a message from Lord Zachary. This is what it read. "Dear apprentice, I'm sorry to say that I have sent you on a bit of a goose chase. I did not send you out for errands. This is your real first lesson. I want to see what you will do in people's lives, so I give you full leave on this, your first day. You can decide what you will do. I want you to go goof off if you want to, or I want you to try and discover something bigger than yourself. If you wish. It's all up to you, really. Your first lesson will decide the course for the rest of what I teach you. If you remember nothing else, remember this. The story your life becomes can only be determined by you. Your life will be what you make of it. Zachary." Drake was at a loss of what to do. He reread the note a couple of times to make sure he had the context right. Okay, so he was supposed to do something now, but what? He started walking. He looked at the people as he passed. There were all sorts: businessmen dressed in expensive suits, store clerks selling things on corners, construction workers building something new behind a fence. There were even new apprentices running errands throughout the city. Homeless people lurked in the shadows just out of sight. People sat in the parks or cafes and restaurants, eating and enjoying each other's company. Drake was so wrapped up in looking at everyone and everything around him, he didn't see the next person he would talk to that day. Drake was knocked off his feet as the person ran into him. "Hey," Drake said as he looked up a concrete walkway, surprised at the sudden collision. The person who'd run into him was a boy about his age, with straight black hair and bright green eyes. He was wearing a black t-shirt and a gray leather jacket that suggested he definitely didn't have to worry about landing an apprenticeship. "Sorry," Drake said. "You took me by surprise there." "Don't worry about it. I should have been looking where I was going," the boy said with a grin as he picked himself off the street. Drake watched the boy closely as he got up himself. Where had this guy been going in such a hurry? He must have been a new apprentice too, Drake guessed. The boy held out his hand. "I'm Thomas Smith, by the way. What about you?" the boy asked. Drake shook the boy's hand. "I'm Drake 80. Nice to meet you." Drake was surprised by the fact that he was grinning now too. "What?" Thomas said, confusion flashing across his face. Could this really be their son? The kid of the smartest tech scientists in all of Kishato? "No way! Isn't son of David and Sarah 80? "Yeah, why?" Drake asked, taken aback. How did this stranger know his parents? Drake thought the boy seemed a little too surprised by the question. "I just knew about some of your father's work. A lot of his research was funded by my dad's company. I heard about what happened to them. I'm sorry," Thomas answered. "Yeah," Drake said slowly. "That's cool. About your father funding my dad's research, I mean. It's nothing special, really, Thomas said. He does it for a lot of small-time scientists and engineers. Although I wouldn't exactly call the stuff your father worked on small-time. Thomas glanced down at his watch. Aw, man. Listen, it was really nice meeting you, Drake, but I've got to go. My apprenticeship starts in 5 minutes. Oh, yeah, you better be going then, Drake said. Yeah. Hey, maybe we could meet up later, Thomas yelled, as he started to walk away quickly. Do you know where the city's Memorial Park is? Drake did. It wasn't far from his uncle's apartment, and he remembered riding past it on his wheelboard. Yeah, he yelled. Cool. Meet me there tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Then Thomas turned around and started running. Drake grinned as he watched the boy disappear down the street. Something about Thomas had really connected with him. If he had more time, he was sure the two of them could have been great friends. That was when Drake noticed Thomas had forgotten his backpack in all the commotion. He turned to call out to Thomas and tell him, but the boy was already gone. He had disappeared into the crowds of people. Drake sighed and picked up the bag. He noticed one of the pockets was partly unzipped when something caught his eye. He pulled the zipper back a little more, and then closed it just as quickly when he saw what was in it. He quickly dropped off the main street and into a small alley. He double-checked to make sure no one was around, and then reached down into the bag to see if the shiny object was what he thought it was. He was perplexed to say the least when he pulled out the black gauntlet. At least he thought it was a gauntlet. It looked like a metallic glove, and it felt cold to his touch. He had only ever heard about gauntlets in fairy tales. It was the sort of thing a knight would wear if knights weren't just make-believe. What in the world was it doing in Thomas's backpack? Probably even more importantly, where had he gotten it? Who had he just met? Citizens of Copolis weren't allowed to own weapons, and a gauntlet definitely qualified as a weapon, didn't it? He should have put the gauntlet down then and there. If someone caught him with it, he would be in big trouble. Drake could see his reflection in the dark metal. He didn't know what came over him, but suddenly he felt the need to put it on. He slipped his arm into it. At first it was way too big for his hand. He felt silly that he had even tried to wear it. He would certainly be arrested if anyone saw him wearing it. Then it started to glow. The light grew brighter and brighter until he was blinded by it. Drake saw thousands of pictures flash before his eyes, and when they stopped, he felt like he was suddenly plunged into a bucket of ice-cold water. Cold everywhere. That was the last thing he remembered before he passed out.